All right, Alexander. Strikes in France. There were actually protests this
Mm,
weekend in France. Now, these
mm,
protests were anti-NATO, anti-EU, and I have to say, for protests in France, I would say they were I would give it a medium turnout. Not small,
mm.
but
Yeah,
not huge or massive.
no, no.
Respectable turnout. But
Mm.
we have something more that's happening in France, and that has to do with
Yeah, yeah.
strikes that are taking place. What is going on?
Yeah, it's industrial action by workers who work at the oil refineries. And what they're complaining is that inflation is eating away at their incomes. And at the same time, the companies they work for are making massive profits because of the huge increase in energy prices, oil prices, and all of that. So they're saying, why should they have to bear the brunt of, you know, all these cost of living increases whilst their employers are doing as well as they are? And completely unsurprisingly, they have gone on strike. And there are now extensive problems with gasoline at French filling stations. If you follow French news, there's long queues at filling stations. People are finding it difficult to get petrol. And remember, if you go back a couple of years, if we go back to the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, all the protests there all started with the price of diesel, issues about the price of diesel, about fuel shortages, and that is an important issue in France. Now, you mentioned the protests in France about NATO and about all of that, and you said that these are of only medium size. Of course, the great danger for the French political leadership, for Emmanuel Macron specifically, is if all of these various issues, the question of NATO, the question of EU, the resentments in the French industrial system, the fact that all refinery workers are coming out on strike, there's rumblings that other people might start coming on strike. If all of these people come together into a single protest wave, both in the industrial sector and on the streets, then France is looking at a 1968 situation, May 1968, with one very important difference, which is that, of course, Macron, well, two important differences. Firstly, three important differences. Macron is not de Gaulle. He does not have the stature that de Gaulle did in 1968, even if de Gaulle was becoming increasingly unpopular. He also doesn't have the sympathy of the military. De Gaulle he was considered at one point bringing in the military to try and restore the situation in France. We know that the military in France are very, very unhappy with Macron, that there's a lot of criticism of him from within the military. And the third, the third difference is that, of course, the French Parliament, the Legislative Assembly, Macron does not have a majority there. So his position is, on the face of it, a lot more fragile than that of de Gaulle at the start of the 1968 protests. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the thing protesters are now starting to demand, going beyond questions of NATO membership, EU membership, fuel prices, all of those things, they're now starting to demand Macron's resignation. So, we are perhaps at the beginning of a protest wave, which is going to be much bigger even than the yellow vest protest wave. And bear in mind, he's not a particularly popular president. He's not a popular president at all in France. So this is perhaps a sign of things to come. But I suspect that, as I said, unless he's able to manage things with skill, he's going to find himself under increasing political pressure from this point.
Okay, so yellow vests went on for months on end, and what did they really accomplish? To be quite honest, I'm trying to figure out, did they
Well,
accomplish anything? Macron still won the presidential elections. Yes, he's weakened.
absolutely.
He's weakened in the parliament,
No.
but he still won. I'm not even sure about any concessions that were made with regards to yellow vest, because that was with regards to fuel protests and all these things. Nothing really
No.
changed, did it? So why would it be different this time around?
Yeah.
And we've seen Macron's answer to protest. I mean, we know what he does. He cracks down on protesters hard. He's going to do the same thing
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Right. He's get no, absolutely. Now, can I just say a few things about this? First of all, the Yellow Vests achieved absolutely nothing. He made no concessions. He cracked down. He won the election. He is still president of France. However, this is a thing to say about France. What the Yellow Vests did do, I don't know it's an achievement exactly, but they did create a widespread sense in France. They reinforced a sense in France that there is something about Macron that is somehow un-French and not wholly legitimate. They created, if you like, a perception of him as a sort of alien outsider who's not really there for the French, and also whose political position is, shall we say, not broadly supported in France. And I think that that thing has taken hold and is now spreading. It's like, if you can think about it, the Yellow Vests were the first cancer cell within the French political system. And that cancer is now, wasn't enough in itself to kill, but it's now starting to spread. And it's trickling through French society. Now, Macron can throw the police, the CRS, the famous riot police that they have in France, other forces like that, to deal with protesters on the streets. Of course, it does to some extent depend on how many protesters. But if he gets a strike wave, if strike waves start to escalate, if there is an explosion of strikes, then of course his position becomes much more difficult, because realistically he can't arrest all the strikers, and it would probably be very unwise for him to even try to do things like that. So that's the danger he has. That's, it seems to me, where things are. And if you go back to, previous periods in French history, it tends to start like this. There's sort of rumblings amongst the French about, they protest, they come out, the authority holds on until eventually the whole thing develops a kind of critical mass, and then a really severe crisis begins. And coming back to what I said before, the perception that Macron is remote from the French people, and he's not really somebody who stands for France, something which, as I said, to some extent, calls into question his legitimacy as France's leader. That is a dangerous position for a political leader who's under pressure to find themselves in. And Macron is starting to look a little bit like that.
Yeah, but he is remote from the French. I mean, why would this be a surprise to the French people? I mean, this is Macron. It's been Macron for the past five plus years. This isn't a surprise. So why would him
absolutely
appearing to be remote from the French be a cause for a type of stronger uprising? I'm just trying to figure out what is going to distinguish these protests from the Yellow Vests with regards to an actual goal being accomplished.
The fact, as I said, that there's an industrial aspect to them, which in France is important. I mean, the thing to understand about 1968, the reason 1968 became such a threat to the stability of de Gaulle's government was not that there were students protesting in the streets. I mean, de Gaulle wouldn't have worried about that. It is the fact that France was in the grip of a general strike, that workers, in other words, quit the factories. And the reason 1968 didn't result in the collapse of the French government, and this is something which a lot of people don't realize, but people I know who were there knew it very well. My mother, for example, was actually in Paris when it was all going on. The key event that prevented the government from collapsing was the fact that the French Communist Party sided with de Gaulle. They decided that they did not want him to fall, possibly perhaps for geopolitical reasons. Also, they were concerned that if he did fall, the US might gain preeminence. But whatever it was, and they had enough traction with French workers to bring the whole protest thing, the strike protest wave to an end. Now, if there is industrial protests in France, then of course the whole thing starts to take a different quality to just street protests. The yellow vests never evolved beyond street protests, and that's why these refinery strikes are perhaps dangerous for Macron. And of course, on top of that, they are dangerous in that they are affecting the performance of the French economy, which is, of course, difficult for Macron too. There's something else which has changed. When Macron became president, and even when the Yellow Vests protests began, I mean, he wasn't popular. He never has been particularly popular. He never, he did seem very remote from the French people, but he did appear very powerful. He did seem to have the whole machinery of the state well behind him. He had a very big majority in the French parliament. I mean, all of the various elements that made up the French political structure were very much under his control. That's not so any longer. He's lost his majority in the French parliament. The military has been openly critical of many of his decisions. So he doesn't come across today as the enormously strong figure that he was 5, even 3 years ago.
Is it even possible to remove a French president? I mean, are there mechanisms for such a thing?
Incredibly difficult. I mean, that is, of course, his huge advantage. I mean, it's almost, I can't imagine any constitutional mechanism to remove him. The only way he can be removed is if he resigns. And of course, that's what the calls now that are being made are what people are calling for. But, bear in mind, this is a country where constitutions change. I mean, the King of France in the 1780s, there was no mechanism, you could say, to remove him, but he was removed in a very revolutionary way. France has a history of things being done which take an extra constitutional form. And not so long ago, contrary to what many people think, the last time that happened in France was in 1958, when a whole series, a political crisis emerged, which resulted in de Gaulle coming to power, despite the fact that he was operating. De Gaulle was completely outside the constitutional structures, and there was no obvious reason either why the existing government should fall or why de Gaulle should become France's prime minister and then president, which is what he did. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. And I think that's another point I do want to make. I mean, I come back to my original point. There is lots of criticism, lots of protest in France, and it's more diverse and it's more broad-based than it was at the time of the Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vest protests were protests focused on provincial France. It was people, in the small towns and places on and around France. They were the people who were unhappy. This is more broad-based. It looks more broad-based, but it hasn't yet come together. It's not yet achieved that degree of critical mass. The question is whether it will, whether Macron has the political skills to keep all these various parts of the protest movement, if you like, movements, if he has the skill to keep them divided from each other, to basically appease one, intimidate another, play them off against each other, do those sort of things, which French political leaders have been skilled at doing in the past. Whether he can do that, or whether the processes that we see, which they might all come together and challenge him, whether that will happen instead. So I want to qualify everything like that I've said by making it clear that we are not at that position yet, but these refinery strikes are a problem for Macron. They're going to be an increasing problem for Macron. And do bear in mind that they're happening at a time when there's a general economic crisis and a sense of growing malaise across Europe as a whole. I mean, we have a Europe that's spiraling downhill, and this is perhaps, if you like, a warning sign that things are starting to slip, that they're starting to get out of control. So it's not a done thing that Macron is going to fall, not at all. But it is beginning to look as if the situation is becoming more dangerous for him than it's been until recently.
All right, let's end this video there. theduran.locals.com, and also look for us on Rockfin as well. I will put the Rockfin link as a pinned comment down below. Take care.